The Park Center for Independent Media at Ithaca College presents the 2012 Izzy Awards, an annual recognition of outstanding achievement in independent media.
Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm Jeff Cohen, welcoming you on behalf of the Park Center for Independent Media and the Park School of Communications. Tonight we celebrate the Izzy Award for Special Achievement in Independent Media. The Izzy is named after I.F. Izzy Stone, the legendary journalist who in 1953 launched I.F. Stone's Weekly. It exposed Senator Joe McCarthy's witch hunts. It exposed war based on deception. That's a theme every decade. He challenged racism. He resisted censorship. At our awards ceremony, there's no red carpets. There's no opening comedy routine. There's no thanking of nannies and agents. Just a celebration of independent media work. So let's get right now to tonight's winners.
Down with military rule, the clarion call of a new uprising in Egypt. The revolution that erupted 10 months ago and succeeded in ousting 30-year autocrat Hosni Mubarak has reignited in Tahrir Square and has spread across the country. This time, protesters are rising up against the Supreme Council of Armed Forces that came to power after Mubarak's ouster, in what is perhaps the biggest challenge to military rule in Egypt in 60 years. Sharif is an Egyptian protester.
I think that the elections are not going to make a difference to the fundamental issue that we're living under a military government. It's an exercise in legitimacy for the military to basically parade around the fact that they're supposedly transitioning to democracy.
Well, Amy, I'm standing just on the outskirts of Tahrir Square, the epicenter of the Egyptian Revolution. And as you can see behind me, it's an absolutely packed day. That 1 year after this revolution began, it still is very much continuing. What happened on January 25th was really an uprising that was 10 years in the making, a growing resistance movement to the Mubarak regime, to a regime that was characterized by a sprawling police apparatus that engaged in quashing of dissent and torture, a paralyzed body politic, and rampant corruption. And that uprising ignited on January 25th. People speak about the barrier of fear being broken, but I really think it was a lack of hope. And that was the gift that Tunisia gave to Egypt, was that here is the dream that you can achieve, and here's the hope that you can change if you take to the streets. And so that's what happened. People had hope that they could cause change, and they started this revolution on January 25th, one that really reverberated across the world, one that changed the way I think many people think about themselves as citizens in a country and in participatory democracy.
What an honor it is to be here tonight to honor Sharif Abdel Kouddous. The first words from Sharif to the world as he landed in Tahrir were through tweets, those 140 characters. And his vivid descriptions and passion for what he saw really shaped how so many saw this incipient revolution that was taking place in Egypt. People holding a sign to America from the Egyptian people: stop supporting Mubarak, it's over. Just describing what he saw as he landed in Tahrir. Sharif came to Democracy Now! In 2003. He was an investment banker. And then he decided to make an investment in all of our futures by becoming a journalist. Combining tremendous talent, intelligence, with what is most important, a heart. I'd like to bring up Sharif Abdel Kouddous for this tremendous honor today, as we honor Sharif Abdel Kouddous as a recipient of the Park Center Award for Independent Media. One of the things that I.F. Stone is famous for when teaching a class was telling students, if you're going to remember just 2 words, remember governments lie. It's Sharif's skepticism and intelligence that I think is also being awarded tonight, as on this award it says, the courageous spirit of I.F. Izzy Stone is alive and thriving in the tireless work of independent journalist Sharif Abdel Kouddous, and I'd like to underscore tireless.
Thank you very much. That was a very humbling introduction by Amy, who really taught me most of what I know about journalism. I always say, and I said earlier today, I was fortunate enough to have a high school education and a college degree, but I really got my education through my 8 years at Democracy Now! And I had to unlearn a lot of things I learned in university. But it's truly an honor to receive this award, and especially to share it with the Center for Media and Democracy and with Lisa Graves, who do such crucial work and have been featured on Democracy Now! Many times for their true investigative journalism that goes to the heart of issues that matter to democracy in this country and elsewhere. And it's especially an honor for me to receive an award that's named after I.F. Stone, who's probably one of the greatest journalists of the 20th century, for that kind of prescient knowledge of something as simple as governments lie can really guide your coverage in the right direction. And his philosophy was really to hold those in power accountable. And I think that goes to the essence of what good journalism is about. The Egyptian Revolution, when it began last year, I think was really a seminal moment in world history. And it was watched by millions of people around the world. It changed the way people thought of themselves as citizens in a state, and the power that they have to affect change. And there was a media study that was done last year covering the 18-day uprising that led to the ouster of Mubarak on February 11th, 2011. And it found that the coverage in this country of the Egyptian Revolution, it was the biggest foreign story covered in the United States since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Now, that's an encouraging development to think about those 2 bookends. The Iraq War being one of the biggest foreign policy disasters that this country has ever committed. And the other one being a popular revolution that really was a struggle for freedom. So on the one hand, you have a war led by a government that tore people apart. And on the other, you have an uprising that really, I think, brought people together and showed our similarities in a global struggle for freedom and justice. But while the corporate networks, TV networks at least in this country, did cover the Egyptian Revolution, at least the first 18 days of it, intensely, I think it was the way that they covered it that highlights fundamental differences between corporate media and independent media in this country. And what you got on a lot of the corporate networks was indicative of the way they usually cover stories, which was a bird's eye view of Tahrir, people looking like ants, and a pundit on TV explaining what was happening, explaining what people wanted, and usually explaining why this mattered to US foreign policy or to Israel or something like that. By contrast, one of Democracy Now!'s philosophies, and something that I learned from Amy, was to give voice to the voiceless, to speak to people on the ground. And so what we typically tried to do was to just put the mic in front of people in Tahrir and ask them why they were there, and have them explain why they were there. And so you heard people, young and old and rich and poor, speaking in Arabic and speaking in English, explaining what their hopes and dreams for, what they were struggling for, and why they were doing what they were doing. And when someone, for example, here in Ithaca, can watch someone in Tahrir and identify with that person, those similarities bring people together. and create understanding. And we saw this kind of inspiration happen in Madison, Wisconsin, in the Occupy movement. So this is the power of independent media that it can have. Another crucial aspect of independent media is drumbeat coverage of a story. And as Jeff mentioned, not to engage in what we can call parachute journalism, where you see a lot of the corporate networks fly into a story, cover it for a few days, and then leave, and that's it. And then they'll move on to Kim Kardashian or something like that. But I mean, that's more likened to entertainment than reporting. So while there was this incredible level of coverage up to February 11th when Mubarak was ousted, the coverage of the Egyptian revolution has dropped drastically since then, especially on television in the US media. And at Democracy Now! And also at The Nation, where I publish most of my work, it's these outlets that continue to have interest in the story. I try to pitch my stories to other places, at least in writing, and no one's interested. But what people don't realize is that the ouster of Mubarak on February 11th wasn't the end of the Egyptian revolution. It was really just the beginning. And what I think is important to realize is that the struggle right now in Egypt has become much deeper. And it's a struggle against really a 60-year dictatorship. And the revolution, ironically, brought to the helm of political power the army, which is really the ruling entity in Egypt. And the state media in Egypt acts as a propaganda arm of the government. And so they supported Mubarak blindly during his tenure. And when he was toppled, for a moment, for 2 days, they supported the protest movement and were praising how great the people of Egypt were to topple the regime. Shamelessly, even just the day before, they had been praising Mubarak. But they quickly, as I always say, they're like a dog that needs a master. And they immediately began acting as the propaganda arm for the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And what has been combating the state media, and what I want to talk about really is this burgeoning independent media movement in Egypt that has grown and have really gone to the heart of the revolutionary struggle in Egypt over the past year. So what the state media has essentially done is to demonize the protest movement, to blame the revolution for economic ills, to blame the revolution for the security vacuum that has occurred, and to champion the policies of the ruling council in Egypt. But to counter this, there's been this growing independent media movement based mostly by media activists, citizen journalists, and they have very bravely and continuously over the past year documented police brutality, documented army brutality, and documented dissent itself. So to go out continually into the streets and to film and to write about and to photograph protests and sit-ins and labor strikes. And to give voice to those people who are continuing this revolution and really pushing it into what some call the next phase, which is addressing socio and economic grievances. And some of this work has had actual tangible results on the ground. So for example, on March 9th of last year, there was a sit-in in Tahrir that was very brutally attacked by the military and by plainclothes thugs working for the state. Hundreds of people were arrested. They were taken, most of them, to the Egyptian Museum, which is just adjacent to Tahrir and was a makeshift army center. Many were beaten. Many were tortured with electric shocks. And a number of women were subjected to so-called virginity tests. This was right in the aftermath of Mubarak's ouster, where the military's popularity was sky high. The state media would not, of course, touch the story, but the private media wouldn't touch the story either. No one believed that these women had undergone this horrible practice of so-called virginity tests. But what independent media activists did was to document what happened. A very brave woman, who was one of the ones who underwent one of these tests by the name of Samira Ibrahim, was willing to be on camera and tell her story despite social and familial pressure against her doing that. She told her story, eventually got picked up by the international media. CNN reported on the story. And eventually her case was brought to trial. She ultimately lost the case, but the fact that this was discussed in the narrative on the national level in Egypt was a victory in of itself. That same day, a man by the name of Rami Assam, who's 23 years old, who's known as the singer of the revolution, he would come out with his guitar in Tahrir and sing protest chants as songs, kind of like a folk a new Egyptian folk musician. He was captured that day on March 9th, and he was dragged into the museum. He's a big guy, and so 6 of the soldiers beat him repeatedly with metal rods and cables. He had long hair. They cut it with glass, and they electrocuted him. And they repeatedly stomped on his head. When he was finally released 2 weeks later, he couldn't walk. And a video of what happened to him, or the bruises on his back and body, was filmed by an independent media activist. He described what happened to him. Very quickly circulated on the internet. Because of his background as a musician, it was also picked up by a lot of the big private stations and the international media and became a big story. And so people eventually started holding the army to account. And this is kind of an example of what Amy has always called trickle-up journalism. So it comes from the bottom up, and we always want in independent media people to take our stories. Whereas you see a lot in the corporate media, this kind of hold on exclusivity. We actually want the information to get out because it's knowledge that we want to disseminate. But perhaps the most glaring example of this battle in Egypt between the state media and the independent media movement occurred on October 9th, of last year, of 2011, which was one of the bloodiest days of the revolution, one of the most difficult for me as a journalist to cover, and as an Egyptian and as a human to witness. But this was on a day when a march of largely Coptic Christians and their supporters in downtown Cairo came under a very violent and brutal attack by the army. This was the first time that the army itself had been engaged in such violence. I was standing there with my cousin, just looking, seeing what was happening, photographing and sending a few tweets, just thought it was a small protest. And within minutes, soldiers began opening fire on the crowd, and then they began to drive APCs, armored personnel carriers, directly into the crowd. 27 people were killed in the matter of half an hour, and hundreds more were wounded. It was a very shockingly violent day. Now, while this was happening, security forces, police and army, raided 2 TV stations that were right nearby that were reporting on what was happening below. And you can even go on YouTube and see the anchor screaming as the soldiers come in on the air and smashing the equipment and taking her off the air. At the same time this was happening, state TV was reporting that the army, erroneously reporting, that the army had come under attack by the protesters, using repeatedly sectarian language and saying the army was coming under attack by Christians and calling on honorable citizens to come defend the army against the Copts, the Coptic Christian minority. It wasn't long before bands of men armed with sticks and clubs were roving around the streets of downtown Cairo looking for Christians. The Coptic Christian hospital, which was treating the hundreds of wounded people, came under attack for several hours. So this is an example of the level of the depth to which the state media will go. Now, the military council eventually had a press conference about this event, and it's not like here where they attempted to explain away the violence or justify it. They simply denied that it even happened. They denied, despite autopsy reports, clear evidence that the soldiers opened fire. They denied, despite clear video evidence, that APCs ran over people. If someone showed them an APC running over someone, they said someone stole the APC, this third party which wants to destabilize the state. But the footage of what happened was captured by independent media activists, citizen journalists in the crowd, who very bravely filmed it. And groups like a new independent media collective called Mosireen took testimonies of witnesses tirelessly for days about what happened. And they edited video. They held a press conference. They showed the video. I was there when they showed it. Many people in the crowd who had never seen it, there was an audible gasp in the crowd. And eventually, the narrative about that day changed. It took a while, but it changed. And people wanted to hold the army to account. So the issues that we're discussing here really are about life and death. Another example of how independent media is manifesting itself in Egypt right now is something called the Kouddous campaign. In December, clashes broke out near Parliament. This was in the midst of the elections for Parliament after the first round. And these clashes broke out on a street just off of Tahrir Square. And they came under vicious attack again by the army. And what happened was army soldiers attacked the protesters, and they had learned their lesson this time. And so while they were doing the attack, they attacked the media as well. And so I ran, as the soldiers were running, everyone was running away, so I ran. I went up to a friend's apartment, and there were some journalists there, video journalists who were photographing, were on a balcony. And I was looking and tweeting and taking notes, and all of a sudden I look and there's an army soldier right next to me. And they had come into the apartment, and they took everyone's cameras. We were protesting, trying to take it away, but they took everyone's cameras there. They took the lenses. I went down to the square. The army had occupied it by then, to try and get the cameras back. I looked behind me. Where Al Jazeera was stationed, soldiers were throwing their equipment off of the balcony that they were filming on, and it was crashing on the sidewalk. So they were trying to shut down any images of what happened, but some images did come out, and some of you may remember the iconic footage and photo of a woman being dragged by two army soldiers, her black habaya pulled over her head, revealing her bra and her exposed stomach, and a third soldier stomping on her chest. Now, the military council, in the midst of these clashes, held another news conference. Again, they denied any wrongdoing. They said they were, in fact, exercising self-restraint, and they showed their own video of what happened, showing protesters hurling rocks and Molotov cocktails at the soldiers. So in response to that press conference, these independent media activists took all the footage that was left, that was available, and held their own press conference. And then they started, Kouddous in Arabic means liars, and they started a campaign called Askar Kouddous, which is like lying army or lying officers. And there's only so much that the internet has reach in Egypt. Only 20% of the population's on the air. Online. So what they did was they took portable video screening equipment, and they went into neighborhoods, mostly poor neighborhoods in Cairo, in Alexandria, and two other provinces outside, and they began screening the army brutality video, often interlaced with the army's denial of any wrongdoing, on sidewalks, on the sides of buildings, once on the side of the Supreme Court. And people would eventually gather. They would watch the videos. Usually a discussion would break out. Sometimes a march would break out. But it was this kind of reclaiming these public spaces to use the street of where this protest movement was born as the media outlet for the revolution. And so this has been continuing since December with several of these Kouddous screenings a day. And it's an encouraging development. I mentioned earlier an independent media collective called Mosireen. They're really at the forefront of this movement in Egypt. And it's something that I've been involved with to some extent through my affiliation at Democracy Now! They've asked me to be an advisory board member, and I'm very proud to be with them. But they have relentlessly documented protests. They go into the streets with shocking bravery. One of them, Salma Saeed, who is a 25-year-old young activist, was shot 3 times with a shotgun while she was filming with a flip cam. She somehow survived, but she's covered in birdshot. And she still goes out and films. But they've been very good at shooting, editing this video, putting it up on YouTube. They pioneered these screenings that the Kouddous campaign copied. They were the first ones to go into Tahrir Square and set up this huge screen and just show footage and start debates and have people talking. Their YouTube channel has become the most viewed nonprofit YouTube channel of all time in Egypt, and the most viewed nonprofit channel in the whole world in the month of January. And I'm proud to say that I'm donating the money from this award to Mosireen, because independent media, we can make these connections, and to support this burgeoning independent media movement in Egypt so it can be made stronger and to flourish. Thank you. So there's plenty to talk about, and I'd love to hear your questions in the Q&A, but we're just out of time. But I just want to end with a quote that a young Egyptian journalist said to me at a meeting about independent media a few months ago. He was quoting an Egyptian intelligence official who was blasting the media, being very critical of the media, and likening journalists to spies. So this young journalist responded by saying, yes, we journalists are like spies. The difference is spies get information on people and give it to those in power. We get information on those in power and give it to the people. So I think that's exactly what independent journalism is about, what Izzy Stone was all about. So let's keep on spying on them and let them know that they're the ones who are being watched. But again, thank you very much for this award. I'm truly humbled. Thank you.
The Alec story, as you probably know, is not really a new story, but the breadth and depth of the Center for Media and Democracy's reporting and analysis have exposed this shadowy collusion between corporations and legislators in all 50 states and the federal government in a way that many who receive the news really receive it with shock and awe that U.S. laws could be so collusionist and that our government is not what we expect it to be. Alec Exposed is a project of the Center for Media and Democracy, which was founded in 1993 by John Stauber. In 2009, Lisa Graves took over as its executive director. She decided she could bring her insider knowledge to investigate and expose parts of our government that do not represent we the people. As Izzy said, governments lie, and she knew that for sure from within. So since its launch last year, Alec Exposed has broken through the great journalism divide. It has gotten incredible independent media and mainstream media coverage, including this video from KMTV in Omaha, Nebraska.
We're told we need changes in our voting laws to make sure nobody cheats on Election Day. But not only is there no proof of a voter fraud problem in either state, there is proof that the lawmakers writing both those laws are not telling you something important about a group called Alec. State Senator Charlie Jansen is confused about why we want to know about the secretive but very powerful group known as Alec.
I didn't use them at all for this bill, so I'm really not even understanding what the relevancy is.
Senator Jansen says no powerful billionaires had any role in his Nebraska voter ID law.
We've experienced a lot of voter fraud across the country.
But even the chief official in charge of Nebraska elections says there's no real problem here. We've had an aggressive voter fraud unit already, and very few people ever try to cheat here. In fact, there's very little proof of any serious voter fraud anywhere, but so far, 31 states have jumped on the voter ID bandwagon anyway. Iowa's headed there too, and with little proof of cheating, many Democrats say it's really all about this man.
For the first time in 9 years,
the voter ID rules will probably keep a lot of the young and poor from voting. Both groups big Obama backers last round, and opponents say that's where this secretive group of powerful conservatives comes in.
Voter ID in your state and a lot of other states is not something that is necessarily being created by the people you elected.
Brendan Fisher works for the Center of Media and Democracy. They publish Alec Exposed. The watchdog group says almost every voter ID bill in the nation shares common elements to a template that's provided by the group American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC for short. ALEC calls itself a nonpartisan membership association for conservative lawmakers who share a common belief. The group includes support from the controversial billionaire Koch brothers and other huge names in corporate America: Johnson & Johnson, Kraft Foods, AT&T, Walmart. The watchdog group says ALEC is writing many of the hot bills our lawmakers claim as their own.
And these think tanks essentially hand state legislators changes to our laws that they desire.
Alec Exposed says this is a model bill for the Voter ID Act. I've studied both Nebraska and Iowa's proposed laws. Both proposed bills hit on every single point in the Alec template. And the co-sponsor of Iowa's bill? This woman, Senator Linda Opmeyer. She has clear ties to Alec. In fact, she's their treasurer. But how about Nebraska's bill?
I was looking at your bill and kind of comparing it to Iowa's bill, and there's a lot of similarities in the language there. Can you talk a little bit about those points?
I really didn't use Iowa's bill to draft my bill. I used Indiana's bill originally.
Indiana's bill? Again, every single point, down to an exception for nursing homes and a Monday deadline for bringing in your late ID. Every single point matches the ALEC template.
Indiana's is very similar to this model draft that Alec Exposed says that this is the model draft for voter ID bills for a lot of these states across the entire nation. Do you know about Alec?
You know what? The first time I've talked about ALEC in 2 years today is when you inquired about it. I'm not a member of ALEC. I've never attended an ALEC function, either here in Lincoln or they have national conventions.
Then I hand him this, a document that still lists the senator on a big ALEC committee.
Yeah, my first year down here, I signed up for ALEC, and then I let my dues lapse.
So I ask him to explain why his bill is remarkably similar to Alec's model bill.
And so your bill is not similar to this. Have you seen that?
No, I'd have no idea. I don't look at any ALEC materials.
But we did, and the match is hard to ignore.
It's my honor to ask Lisa to come up here now and present her with the Izzy Award. The courageous spirit of IF Izzy Stone is alive and thriving in the tireless work of the Center for Media and Democracy.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, I have to say it's a tremendous, wonderful thing to actually have our independent media reported so wonderfully in the corporate media. It's sort of a shock in its own way. But that was sort of the beginning of a number of things that have happened over the last couple of weeks in particular. But before I get into some of those stories for you, I wanted to take a moment to express my gratitude to the Park Center for Independent Media, to the Park Foundation, to Adelaide Gomer, to the judges of this award, Jeff Cohen, Linda Ju, and Bob McChesney, the work of our team at the Center for Media and Democracy, who worked tremendously to help move from the whistleblower material that we received to creating a real resource for independent media, for citizen journalists, and for corporate media to really help tell this story. Mary Batari, Rebecca Wills, Brendan Fisher, Jennifer Page, Sarah Williams, Patricia Barden, Paige Metcalf, Steve Horn, Nicolina Lazick, and others who joined our team afterwards. Sarah Jerving, the tremendous investigative reporter Bo Hodai, who was writing for In These Times and has now joined the center. Our experts that we reached out to help tell this story through the Nation's articles: Wendell Potter, Julie Underwood, Laura Dresser, Joel Rogers, John Nichols of The Nation. Tremendous effort, a collective effort to help break this story last July 13th. And we stand on the shoulders of tremendous work that has gone before about Alec, the work of Mike Elk and Bob Sloan on the private prison industry and prison privatization, the Daily Coast bloggers who have been tirelessly trying to help document Alec, stories that were produced by reporters over the last 10 or 20 years, but that somehow, because the dots weren't there to be fully connected, didn't take hold, were not able to take hold. And so these individuals, the people that I've worked with on this, they share this award with the Center for Media and Democracy. It's their work. It's a collective work, a work of students. Many of the staff that I've mentioned are people who are recent college graduates or in college, who helped to make this investigation possible, who spent tremendous time digging through enormous quantities of material to help tell this story. This is a labor of love to really help shine a light on what's happening in American democracy and what's been happening for many decades, but it's sort of come to a head these last few years in particular, it seems. So let me begin by saying that I think that it's tremendously important for there to be an institution like Park, like the Park School, and tremendously important for there to be support for independent media, for the media work of Amy Goodman and so many others, because you know you're not getting the full story or many facts from mainstream media, from corporate media, so-called mainstream media, from corporate media, from non-independent media, and you're not, and your fellow citizens are not. They're being deeply misled in numerous ways. And this story about Alec has been in some ways hard to tell because a lot of the journalists who cover government have become sort of inured to the normalization, in essence, of corruption, to the ways in which corporate lobbyists just institutionally, bureaucratically, in manifest ways influence our political decision-making in this country. It's so normal, it's so normalized in some ways that they don't even bother to really cover it. Every once in a while there'll be a scandal that breaks through, Jack Abramoff, a person, a villain that they can identify, but a lot of what's happening, a lot of the ways in which we've lost a hold of the American democracy, those stories are really not told except for by independent media. And so we're honored to be part of this community. Let me begin by telling you the story of Alec Exposed, which is to say, last year, as the events were unfolding in Egypt, and there was a tremendous uprising, not equal in size as what was happening in Sharif Square, but a tremendous breakthrough in protesters rising up in the state of Wisconsin in the face of Scott Walker's policies. My organization, the Center for Media and Democracy, basically dropped everything to do hour-by-hour coverage of what was happening in Wisconsin, to report that on PR Watch, and really make sure people understood what was happening, what the policies were, how these dots were connected, who was really controlling the levers. And we saw, and you saw, bill after bill introduced in Wisconsin and other states, these echoes through Ohio, through Indiana, in the South, and the North, and the East, and the West. And there became a little bit of a buzz. Perhaps this was Alec. Who was Alec? When I went to buy the web address, Alec Exposed, the very inquisitive person at the internet service provider said, "Who are you exposing?" And I said, "Alec Baldwin." Because I was so paranoid, I didn't want anyone to know. And then he said, "Oh." And I said, "Yeah, you know, Alec Exposed." And then he went on for a minute, and then there was this pause, and I said, "But he's not naked. There's no nakedness." There's no nakedness whatsoever, because I just didn't want anyone to know what we were basically up to, in essence. So Alec Exposed, as we say in-house, not Alec Baldwin. This is the second most famous Alec, but perhaps it will someday be the most famous Alec. So in the midst of our reporting about a little bit of Alec, pieces of Alec, I was contacted by a whistleblower who had all of the bills that had been approved at Alec meetings over several decades, several years. There were over 850 bills, and I looked at the bills for the very first time, understanding, grasping in some small way the depth and breadth and duration of this agenda to change the rights of the people of this country, state by state, step by step, And it was breathtaking. I knew from the reporting that we had been doing in the spring that there were a number of reports about Alec, but it just didn't have traction. There wasn't much traction. People weren't covering it. Other journalists, for the most part, weren't interested in it. There were pieces that were happening. Bo wrote a tremendous piece the previous year about CCA, but there just wasn't a lot of focus on it. And yet here we had this treasure trove of bills to document the extraordinary extent of corporate influence on our democracy. And I knew that we couldn't afford another one-day report. I knew that through the power of independent media, we had the power to break this story anew, to tell this story in a sort of a fresh way, and just through the sheer drumbeat of our efforts to help bring this story to the fore and help empower other journalists at the CBS affiliate in Nebraska, a very conservative state, a state that has not a history of being on the forefront of independent media or even corporate media, I suppose, to have resources for journalists to help tell this story, to connect these dots. I knew that we had to make this material available and help tell this story in a lot of ways to make it clear what was happening. And so that's what my team and I spent several weeks doing, was poring over those bills, writing on them. The voter ID bill is a sort of a case study of how Alec works. In the early 1990s, President Clinton signed a law into effect about a voter registration that expanded tremendously the number of people in this country registering to vote. A huge number of whites registered to vote. More whites than African Americans, but as a percentage, more African Americans registered to vote. And there was a sudden reaction in the Deep South, the heart of the former Confederacy. They wanted new voter ID laws immediately. Those bills were pretty uniformly dismissed as racist in origin. They didn't get a lot of traction because it's a little bit, you might think it's a little bit unpopular to be against American citizens voting. You might think that would not be a popular platform. But in 2008, President Obama won that election on the base of huge voter turnout by college students and by people in inner cities, by poor people, by people who were, in many ways so sick and tired of what had gone on in the previous 8 years. They, wheeled out and made sure that they voted, waited in lines for hours to have the right to exercise the fundamental privilege of citizenship to vote. So what did Alec do? Alec had a meeting in 2009. It was a task force of Alec. You didn't hear about it, wasn't reported in the news because no press was permitted to be there. That meeting in 2009 was co-chaired by a Utah legislator and the NRA, the National Rifle Association, because Alec's task forces are made up of equal sides, the private sector, which includes corporations and special interests, and the public sector, which includes politicians, elected officials. At that task force, the Alec Task Force, which was then known as the Public Safety and Elections Task Force, which included crime bills, gun bills, immigration bills, and bills that affect our democracy, were considered by a closed-door meeting of special interests and politicians. And at that meeting, the politicians voted as equals with the corporate lobbyists and special interest lobbyists who were there. I think I should say that again because it always shocks me. What Alec does is it provides resort meetings at hotels across the country where specially selected legislators are assigned a public sector task force role on task force like criminal justice or public safety and elections, where they vote as equals behind closed doors with other folks who aren't elected officials, your corporate lobbyist, non-elected official, vote as equals with them on the template to change our laws in numerous ways. Every time I say that, even now that it's been 8 months, I remain sort of in awe at the sort of the hubris of this operation. The idea, which we found in the documents that were provided by the whistleblower, that corporations are entitled to, quote, an equal voice and vote. as if they don't have enough influence already. Through ALEC, corporations have a, quote, under Alec's words, unique partnership with politicians behind closed doors, voting on bills to change our rights, templates to change our rights in state after state, and they do so without telling you at all that this is happening. It's a shocking development. And I think it's also shocking that politicians in this country, upwards of 2,000 of them, probably about 1,000 who are active, would debase themselves and debase their official role in our democracy as our elected representatives to deign to give these corporations an equal say. But that's me editorializing. Let me get back to the reporting part. So what we discovered was that ALEC voter ID bill was approved by this task force behind closed doors, and then it was ratified by the ALEC Public Sector Board. And then lo and behold, it started making its way across the country. And it was, as the CBS reporter indicated, virtually identical in state after state after state. And in most states, it was supported by ALEC legislators. There was no groundswell of desire for this bill among citizens. There's actually hardly any evidence of any substantial voter fraud in this country. The percent, if you look at the voting, is something like 0.000000. It might be a Google number, I don't know. But a Google of a percent of validity of the votes versus voter fraud. And yet, at the behest of ALEC politicians, ratified by ALEC corporations, this agenda has made its way across the country, and its effect will be to make it more difficult for American citizens to vote. It will make it more difficult for you if you move to show your ID that shows who you are and show your residency through your utility bill and be able to vote without going to DMV and getting a new license. It will make it difficult for people who are disabled, who've never had a driver's license, to have to go to DMV and get a special license, not the ID that they've always had to be able to use. And as many civil rights groups have pointed out, it will have a significant impact on the African American population in this country, many of whom live in inner cities and don't drive, use public transportation. It, I think, is designed to have an impact on the turnout in the coming election. And corporations have gone along with that agenda. But I have news, which is to say this past 2 weeks we've had a tremendous breakthrough in what's been happening on ALEC, and a number of corporations that were on ALEC's board have stepped off of ALEC's board. Coca-Cola, Kraft Foods, Pepsi, which was on the board but was active in ALEC, Intuit, the software company, they've all indicated that they are no longer part of ALEC. And just today, the Gates Foundation, actually that was yesterday I believe, the Gates Foundation said that it was not going to give any more funding to ALEC. And this afternoon, McDonald's announced that it would no longer be funding ALEC. Now, as we were reporting on ALEC, we took a look at their financial forms. We looked through all of the 990 tax forms available for them, peered into them quite closely, and we discovered a number of things. One was that ALEC has about $7 million in revenue a year, and 98% of its funding comes from everything but legislative dues. Of those 2,000 legislative members who pay $50 a year, and some of whom are so cheap they have the taxpayer pay it for them, corporations really foot the bill in ALEC. And so when a corporation drops out of ALEC, that perhaps theoretically makes it more difficult for ALEC to operationalize this agenda. And so there have been breakthroughs, but it is a tremendously difficult story to tell, in part because so many people in the media, as I said, in the corporate media, think or have thought that they knew what ALEC was, or they've listened to ALEC's talking points, or they just believe this is lobbying. But we believe at the Center for Media and Democracy that this is most worthy, tremendously worthy of public exposure, because this is not just lobbying, as if that were a sufficient excuse. In fact, ALEC has indicated that it doesn't engage in any lobbying at all. It says that no lobbying occurs even though 800 of its bills, 800 to 1,000 of its bills are introduced in state houses every single year in this country, and they claim that over 20% of them become binding law on the rest of us. They say that's not lobbying. I looked at this in detail because I was curious, as a curious investigator myself. I thought, how can this be? And I realized it was an amazing sleight of hand, which is to say, ALEC's bylaws, which we helped publicize, which they finally filed with the IRS, disclose that the the politician co-chair in every state, and every state in the country, except for New York actually, has an ALEC state co-chair and a corporate co-chair. Every state co-chair has a duty under ALEC's bylaws to get its bills introduced and made into law. So I thought that's amazing because you don't really have to have a lobbyist if the legislator is your super lobbyist, I guess. If your legislator is tasked with getting these bills passed, what do you need a lobbyist for? It's an incredible reimagining of the political landscape. So these are some of the stories that we wanted to tell. The story of Trayvon Martin and the tragic shooting in Florida is a story, just a snapshot of that is, it's a bill that was conceived of by the NRA's lobbyist, Marion Hammer, in the words of Wayne LaPierre, the National Rifle Association president. It was pushed through the Florida legislature with Jeb Bush as governor. After it passed the legislature, Marion Hammer went to a resort, at a fancy resort in Texas, in Grapevine, Texas, where she presented that bill as a model bill to an ALEC criminal justice task force co-chaired by Walmart, the largest seller of long guns and ammunition in the country, and co-chaired by a Texas legislator. And that bill was well received, in the words of the NRA, and unanimously approved in this secret closed-door meeting. It was then ratified by the ALEC board as a model. And then since that time, we've documented through our research and our reporting how ALEC promoted that bill, how it put it on a legislative scorecard, how it highlighted the legislators that were introducing that bill to change the rules for people who are shot and killed by people who may be engaged in vigilante justice, as they say, or who may have used disproportionate force, in my view, deadly force. And ALEC has given interviews with the NRA talking about their close relationship with the NRA. The corporations that fund ALEC have made this agenda possible. The agenda is not just about voter ID, voter suppression. It's not just about privatization of prisons. It's not just about changing the rules for gun laws. It's also about things that affect your rights in countless ways. The laws that are being promoted by ALEC are laws that would make it more difficult for you or your loved one to sue a company if you're injured or killed by a corporation, by a corporate product, by a drug that's been recalled. It would make it more difficult for workers to exercise their rights in the workplace, in the public sector, in the private sector. These bills make it more difficult for states and cities to pass protections against a nuclear plant in your backyard, or fracking, or other highly intensive industrial operations in your neighborhood. It takes away local democracy, puts it in the hands of the state legislators, which ALEC has largely captured in many respects. Makes it more difficult for governments to raise funds to support the public institutions, to provide public services, to fund the safety net that keeps people from falling into desperate poverty and homelessness. At ALEC conventions in August, we learned that through our reporting, through having a reporter on the inside and others on the outside, we learned that ALEC had a seminar on things like warming up to climate change, how increased CO2 is good for you. They are spoon-feeding this information to these legislators. These legislators are taking these ideas and running with them. They come back to the State House and introduce these bills, cleansed of any reference to the fact that they themselves may have already pre-voted on it, done a pinky swear with corporate lobbyists, and introduced the bill without any mention of ALEC, as the gentleman in the video, in essence, did in talking about how he just miraculously thought of this bill and had no idea that it was an ALEC bill. What we know is, what we know from our investigative work is that this agenda is indeed, and I'll now editorialize for a second, an extreme agenda. It's one that seeks to minimize the power of ordinary people in the American democratic experiment. It manifests an agenda that indeed is part of the long-standing agenda of the Koch brothers and the Koch family. I wrote a report for The Nation about the Koch's role in ALEC, about this privatization zeal. The notion that our public schools were communist was taught at the foot of David and Charles Koch's father, and that therefore they were socialist and they had to be, in essence, dismantled. That social programs were, of the New Deal, were communist and socialist. The idea that the Supreme Court of the United States was a communist plot, basically. These are the lessons that these two future billionaires were taught at a young age, and I think in Alec they've found one way to help make their vision of the world legally binding on the rest of us through templates to change the law in a number of ways, including privatization of Social Security, privatization of public institutions. In fact, at the conference last year, we discovered that at one of the meetings, the Alec members were talking about how the government shouldn't own any institutions. They should be sold to the private sector, and we should lease them back from corporations. It's an extraordinary story of a countless set of ways in which corporations, with the aid of politicians, are working to divert our tax dollars into the private sector for-profit machine, and to do so without letting us know that this is what's really going on. And so it's been a tremendous honor for us at the Center for Media and Democracy to help tell this story. It's been a tremendous honor to see so many other journalists in the independent media, and now more recently in the corporate media, starting to tell this story and break through. Our philosophy, our independent philosophy, is we don't take any corporate money and we don't take any government grants and we don't seek them. We have deep skepticism about what government says, what elected officials say, and also about what corporations say. Our philosophy, if we had a bias, would be that we don't believe in just repeating quotes. We want to tell the story that the facts tell, that the documents tell. And so that's why we're especially honored to be the recipient of the I.F. Stone Award, because Izzy Stone said repeatedly how essential it was to just dig through mountains of material to get the facts, to get the truth, and get the truth out to the American people, to have confidence that if they could see the truth, see the facts, see the documents, that it would open their eyes and help transform our country for the better. And so it's a great honor indeed to be recognized with this award. Thank you so much.